Okay. So to introduce our speaker for today, Donald has been an IBDP English A educator and examiner for more than a decade. He is currently an IBDP English A and TOK educator at the American School of Doha, Qatar. More recently, Donald has been recruited to work as a curriculum developer for the IB. Donald has taught internationally in the Middle East and North Africa region, as well as in Central America. During his time as an educator, Donald has held several positions of responsibility, including TOK coordinator. Educated in Jamaica, Donald is currently pursuing a doctorate of education at the University of Bath in the UK. Thank you, Donald, for being with us today.
Okay, no worries. Thank you as well for inviting me.
Of course. My name is Susan Bedian, and I've been a DP educator for 7 years in India, and I'll be the moderator for this session today. The purpose of today's panel is to provide you with the insights regarding the learner portfolios. Donald will share his experiences and expertise with regards to this to help both teachers and students with this aspect of the curriculum. The structure of today's session will be a list of questions that I will ask Donald for approximately 20 minutes, followed by a 10-minute window to take any further questions from the audience. Please make sure that you keep your cameras off and your mics on mute. If you do have any questions during the session, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat box. Great. Shall we begin? Okay. So Donald, my first question to you today is, how do you organize the learner portfolio?
All right, so the learner portfolio there is no prescribed way of organizing learner portfolio. What I've done with my learner portfolios for my students is that I've given them 3 different headings under which they should create their activities for the learner portfolio. So the first one, I call it learner portfolio tasks. These are specific tasks that I give them that they have to complete. So for example, a lot of the tasks that I would give my students are taken from Harvard Project Zero, which encourages critical thinking. So for example, it might be an activity like peel the fruit, where they have to move from the external aspects of the text or the extract, if we're looking at an extract, working their way all the way to the central theme of the work and the implications. The second aspect of it is what I call individual thoughts. This is where the student creates their own portfolio entry based on maybe something that inspired them in class, something they've seen out of class, or they might want to do an additional activity similar to one that they've done as one of the learner portfolio tasks, something along those lines. And the third element that I've included is reflections. So they have to do reflection on assessments, reflections on something that they have learned. I usually have them start out doing SMART goals. So at the start of the year, they would have done SMART goals and trying to sort of figure out where they are and what they'd like to achieve. And then periodically we come back to their SMART goals to see where they are in relation to those goals and where they like to be moving forward again. So reflections like those, or reflections on summatives, more primarily formatives, because those feed into the summatives, but reflections on both formatives and summatives. It might be reflections on something they've done in class or on a weakness that they have identified. Usually, I would like them to reflect on specific comments relating to specific aspects of the rubric that I've asked them to look at. So to reiterate, it's 3 parts: portfolio tasks, individual thoughts, and reflections.
Okay, great. That seems very helpful and well structured for sure. So following up with that, is the learner portfolio graded, or does it influence the student's grade in any way?
Yes and no.
Okay.
What the IB has said, what the IB says, it's not graded, full stop. So it is not graded at all. However, what the IB has said in the guide is that the learner portfolio may be required, the school might be required to produce learner portfolio in the event that there is some discrepancy with academic honesty. So you might be required to produce it to say, hold on, this is what the student has done over the years or over the year, and you can pull out the aspects related to the particular task that might be in question. So that's one way it might become useful. However, because of COVID, the learner portfolio technically has been used to contribute to students' grades. Because what has happened in the last 2 years, as most of us here probably would know, the IB has removed certain elements, certain components of the assessment. So there is no paper 2, for example. Previous year, there was no paper 1. So the only assessment was the oral, pretty much, for English. What the IB did last year for the last cohort was that they sent to schools a number, sort of like a statistical number of how many students you can predict grades. And the predicted grade was important because the predicted grade was, in most cases, 50% of the actual student's grade. It replaced the external assessments. So let's say the IB is using their historical data to say that you can only have 2 7s, because historically, on average, you've only had 2 7s. But you have a cohort with 5 amazing students. How do you now say to the IB, I actually have 5 students who could get 7s, even though historically we only get 2, the learner portfolio. So most schools last year used their learner portfolios, we did use our learner portfolios to justify why we think we'd have additional students outside of the historical number. So is learner portfolio graded? No. But should it be taken seriously? Yes, because it can be proof or evidence as to why a student should actually get a higher grade. So technically, that's where the yes part comes in. In some ways, especially for the last couple of years, it has had that element of contributing to students' grades.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I think a lot of schools did struggle with showing, justifying the grades that they have had to give to the IB, especially when the allotted number of grades was below what they expected. And I think something like the learner portfolio is a great way to justify that, yes, the student is deserving of a 6 or a 7, say. And then
it's the only way you probably can justify it, because you cannot use assessments. The IB said you couldn't use assessments. You couldn't then show assessment to kids were you doing to say, look at their grades. You had to find another way to justify it. And the learner portfolio literally is the only sensible piece of work that you can show as to why these students should actually get higher grades.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to look at the learner portfolio as well. And when working on learner portfolios, Donald, what platform do you recommend students use for their learner portfolio?
I don't recommend any. Obviously, students can use any platform they want. I think the beautiful thing about this new curriculum is that it allows for student autonomy, teacher autonomy, but student autonomy as well. So I had students who used Google Classroom and created it that way. I had students who used some fancy online way of producing the document through their iPad. So they were able to draw and do creative pieces through their iPad. You have students who use websites. So you have students who use like Weebly, for example, as a website, or even Google Sites. I don't think there should be a recommended platform, because if you have a recommended platform, what you're doing is stifling student creativity. So I think we should allow the students to choose a platform that they are most comfortable with to produce the work. What is most important is that however it is produced, you now need to have a document that you can produce to then send to the IB. So what I've said to my students is, I don't care how you produce it. I want when it's done, it can be something converted into a PDF. So a Google document sort of worked beautifully for that. But there are other platforms that work well. The Weebly as a website doesn't necessarily lend itself to that sort of conversion. So I think what we have to think through carefully is, if we need to produce this learner portfolio, how can it be produced in such a way that it can be shared with the IB? So that's probably the only caveat perhaps in my thinking as to the restrictions. But apart from that, I think we shouldn't choose. I think the student should choose.
Okay, understood. As an educator though, is there anything that you have preferred as a platform that you found as a teacher was easier for you to use as opposed to another one, say?
Well, as I mentioned, Google Drive worked easier. Sorry, Google Docs worked easier. Because once they create that Google Doc, it's easier for me to convert it into a Word document. But at the same time, our students, my students at least, I'm sure, and we can all see the same, are far more tech savvy than we are. So they can still find that platform and still convert it into a form that is usable or it is shareable with the IB.
Okay, nice. While we're continuing with our panel discussion, I do urge our audience members to send in any questions that you might have for Donald in the chat that we can address in our Q&A session at the end of this panel. My next question.
I have a query.
Okay. Hi. If you can put in your questions in the chat, then we can address it at the end of our session. Thank you. So my next question, Donald, is how do you get students to take the learner portfolio seriously? So like you said, it's not a graded component, right? So explaining that something that is not graded, students have to take seriously can be quite a challenging task for educators. So how do you think teachers can go about it?
Graded. Okay, so first of all, I mean, probably the easiest way is to, depending on what your school allows in terms of assessment, is to give it some sort of assessment component. With my previous school, part of my semester grade or reporting grade, there was a 10% that I called class participation. And so the learner portfolio was graded in the sense that if they weren't doing a learner portfolio, they weren't getting class participation grades, which inevitably can impact their grades. I think also being open and honest about the value of the learner portfolio. If students know that this document might very well mean the difference between me being able to say they could be predicted a higher grade if that situation arises. And the reality is we're in a new sort of world. We don't, whenever we can't say that after this year, even the current grade 11s who are going into grade 12 next year, we can't say that they're going to do the full examination because we don't know what's going to happen next year. Everything has been unpredictable for the last 2-3 years. So being honest with students and saying, hey, listen, the learner portfolio actually made a big difference for previous cohorts because we could have or used it for them, or the fact that they didn't take it seriously might have affected them. So I think perhaps the best thing is to just be open with students and say, this is the value of it. It can contribute to your grade, even though it's not graded. It can provide evidence for me to predict you higher than the IB is allowing me to predict you. I was that honest and open with my students, and they took their learner portfolio seriously for that reason. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way, the easiest way. Inevitably, some students won't take it seriously because it's not graded. So my way around it was to attach some sort of grade to it internally. Another way that my current school would allow me to address it as well is if your school does a sort of criterion-based grading where you have the professional judgment to say, this is where you are at, rather than averaging your total grades, then again, you can say the learner portfolio is a quantitative way of me using my professional judgment because you've shown me your growth over the same period of time in your learner portfolio. So I guess it depends on how your school allows you to assess your students. That will then give you some sort of leverage, if you want to say, in terms of leveraging the learner portfolio. Sorry.
Understood. Yeah, that makes sense. And my last question to you, Donald, today, before we go on to our audience questions, is how do you use the learner portfolio to support teaching and learning?
If the students are using it well, then, all right, so first of all, I guess I have the learner portfolio tasks. So I'm creating these specific tasks that are targeted towards elements of the course that I want to teach. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I use is, and this is readily available online, you can Google Project Zero, Harvard Project Zero, and you can readily get critical thinking activities. Why that is important? Because criterion B for every aspect of the English B is literally critical thinking. It's analysis and evaluation, and that is literally the definition of critical thinking. So if you are pulling on these activities from Project Zero, that is actually teaching critical thinking, then they've made your life easier in terms of teaching criterion B. Now, that said, by creating these specific tasks that I'm forcing the students to do in terms of critically think, then I'm using the learner portfolio in that regard, in terms of enhancing teaching. But on the flip side, especially if we have students who are engaged and are really into the whole process, first of all, they can create in the individual thoughts their own activities that target the things that they think they need to look at that probably would have come out of their reflections anyways. So if the students are using the reflection aspect of the learner portfolio to identify their weaknesses, then they would be creating these individual thoughts or activities that is geared towards fitting that based on the task that I would have given them specifically. So all three elements work together because I'm giving them these tasks that is geared towards improving teaching. But if they're using the reflections and reflecting on their weaknesses, then they can create their own individual thoughts / tasks to target their own areas of weakness. And then I can be giving them feedback, and the process just keeps going on and on and on throughout the whole year or the whole 2 years.
Interesting, great. I know that you had shared a few learner portfolio samples with me, Donald. Would you like the audience members just to see maybe 1 or 2 of them?
Yeah, sure, why not?
So I'm just going to share my screen. You can tell me which one to open up, and maybe the audience can see how, look at one of your exemplars essentially. Which one would you like me to open up?
You could open any one there. Let's try Tala Gazala.
Which one is that?
That one, yeah.
This one, okay, got it. Great.
Yeah, so she, I'm not sure, again, as I mentioned, is as long as it can be turned into a PDF. So this one, she used a platform that allowed her to include a lot of artistic work.
Okay. Yeah, this looks really nice.
So she divided this one again, she divided into parts. So she had part 1, literature. Actually, I think this was the first year that I did it, and I gave them the freedom to organize it the way they wanted to organize it. So maybe this is not the best one to show. Maybe you should go back to the second year when I did it, and I kind of have so let's try higher study, the first one.
Okay.
So scroll down. So if you look at this one, you see it's divided into the 3 parts I mentioned. You realize there is the learner portfolio task, there is the individual thoughts and the reflections.
Yeah, nice.
And then again, she used a platform that allowed her to have these designs, and then she inserted it on the PDF.
Okay, very nice.
And if you scroll down, you see where there's a lot of artistic work. Some of these are like extracts that I've asked them to analyze. I mentioned the SMART goals earlier. So this is our interim SMART goal reflection. And she has her artwork that she puts in when we looked at group identity as a concept. When we analyze images again, so some of this is her additional work. So we would have probably done 1 in class, but she's done additional, as I mentioned, for individual thoughts.
Yeah, this is very comprehensive. Wow. Maybe we can scroll down to the second part of it if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, so some of these would be specific tasks that I gave them to do in class.
Okay. So these are all things that the student herself has done.
They would be based, some of them would be like activities that we've done in class, and then because they're learner portfolio task, and she's done the task and put it in the portfolio.
Okay, great. Wow. And I think I'll just skip right to the end to the reflections bit just to show our audience what that looks like as well. Class participation. here. I guess this is it,
Yeah,
right?
reflections, yeah.
Okay,
So
very nice.
so it was on a Google Doc, so you realize these are my comments on the side, and she's actually highlighting my comments and commenting on the things that I've commented for her.
Okay. Very nice.
She's critically engaging with the reflections that the feedback I've given her. Again, here comes the SMART goals again. So she's periodically checking back in with her SMART goals.
Okay. Lovely. And this is peer feedback, I can see.
Yeah.
Great. So I think this gives our audience a good idea of what a typical learner portfolio can look like. Thank you for that, Don. Yeah.
No worries.
So let's take a few audience questions. So we have one which says, is there any specific format to be used for the learner portfolio? Our first question.
As I mentioned, no, there is no specific format for the learner portfolio. It's free for the students to choose how they want to do it. As I mentioned, you realize the first one was the first year I gave the students that autonomy, and then so they divided into different parts. She said part 1 literature, part 2 language. So she had an individual oral part. So that was their way of organizing it. I shifted from that to give them those 3 specific elements that I want the learner portfolio to look at, because as I mentioned, there's a sort of interrelationship between all 3 parts and the teaching process.
Got it. Understood. Another one was, how much lesson time do you devote to the portfolio?
No lesson time really. I mean, apart from the initial setup. So there might be an initial setup class where I explain the learner portfolio and what needs to be done. Then what happens is if I'm teaching a concept, then I'll have, maybe if I'm using a Google slide to present my content, I'll have a slide that says learner portfolio activity. And it's probably the same class activity, because if it's a learner portfolio task, it's a class activity they'll be doing anyways, but it should go in their learner portfolio. Or they know beforehand that reflections need to be in their learner portfolio. So they'll include the reflections on their assessments, etc. So there is no real class time devoted to learner portfolio. It's really the students' independent work, and in a lot of cases done outside of classwork.
Okay, got it. I think that's it. I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. In case anybody else does have any questions, you can quickly pop them into the chat and Donald can address them for you. But I can see from the comments that a lot of people really liked the sample work that we just displayed for them. So I think that's given them a fair idea of how to go about it as well. Great. Okay, thank you so much, Donald. Really, really appreciate you taking out a time on a Sunday to be with us here today, and to all of our audience members as well. Thank you so much for dropping into this panel discussion. And that's it. We can wrap up the session. Thank you so much, audience.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.